Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Montaperti fought on September the 4th, 1260. This is not the usual tactical analysis video. Actually, we will make another one for the Battle of Montaperti. That is one of the most important battles of the 13th century, as well as one that is not entirely reconstructible, unfortunately, in depth, but that is worth, of course, the challenge. I have some ideas about this. Today I want to rather talk about also the engagement, of course, but more like the spirit, the times, the context, especially considering how we have started for the regional historical series, the chapter on Florence. We arrived to the beginning of the 12th century, so maybe it would have been better to talk about the Florentine 13th century first, but I actually made a video about, if I'm not wrong, multiple videos actually about medieval Siena that already introduced, of course, the Sienese victory at Montaperti, and another series of videos like the ones, for example, about Manfred of Sicily. We talked about the Welf and Ghibelline struggle, so there is something more here. Especially I am increasing the Tuscan warfare content, which it's really time after all these years on Schwerpunkt to really develop for its great historical relevance. And looking in fact at the local rivalries of these Italian city-states by this point, in the second half of the 13th century, is probably a sense of statehood that does correspond in fact to the military fort we will see now at so many civilizational levels. Also artistically, we have beautiful imagery here, but probably in the modern thinking, the innovative way of telling history, of recounting also the greater details, and still within the universal frame, right? The imperial background. These are the years of the Great Interregnum in Germany. The Italians are a bit on their own, but there is a powerful, in fact, Hohenstaufen still in the south, that is leading, backing, sponsoring the central northern Italian Ghibellines. I made it, as you know, a series recently about central northern Italian warfare between the 11th and the 14th century. So if you want additional military historical background to this otherwise very homogeneous, in fact, military culture in the center north, the Italy of the communes, right? You can really appreciate that. And then in the future, we will get a bit more in depth into the smaller realities, such as, I don't know, Arezzo, Lucca, or look in this case, Volterra, and other towns that were, however, proper civitates, communes and states, right? Regardless of the size of the dominant ones, primarily Florence. Florence that is, however, still far, and it will remain so for a good century and more, from a, say, complete dominance over Tuscany. Right, Florence was to rise, like by the early 14th century, to probably the highest level of wealth in the entire world per capita. Yet it did not achieve say a comparable territorial dominion, suffering actually lots of reversals, which Montaperti is one of the most famous and important ones. There are lots of sidebars to this. For example, it happens to be a coincidence that exactly these days are the ones of the famous Sienese Palio. That is one of the most hardcore, I'd say, medieval European legacies still being performed at community level. It's essentially a race which stems from the joust and this kind of, in fact, paramilitary training exercises that especially the people, right, in the communes participated into. There is the Book of Montaperti, which is an unicum in medieval history entirely, which also tells you a lot about how frustrating it is to study, in a sense, of trying to reconstruct battles at this point. It is in fact the only document that tells us, not even to a full degree of completion, but intentionally for how so it's being preserved, thankfully, like the entire composition of a medieval army through the registers of the calls properly of the people, the individual citizens that had to participate in it. It's an extremely interesting source. It's not like you could imagine like a true list. It's a very bureaucratic, administrative thing, but it's the only type of source that essentially tells us, like, gives you this section of the inner, like, organization of a medieval army. For the rest, like also for Montaperti for that matter, and also this highly, actually the single most documented reality in the world at this point of the Italian communes, these numbers, right? That's the say, I don't know, the Florentine army was 30,000 men, which is a lot, by the way. And also, people say that medieval armies were small. This was a single city that is able to field as many men, and that otherwise, in fact, is relatively unknown. I remember there was, during the PhD, a professor who told me you should study some, I don't know, indenture condotta contract to understand how a medieval army is composed, except notoriously it's the narrative sources that give you the quantities, and even if you have the luck to find in an archive a condotta, an indenture, or the equivalent, other, say, linguistical equivalent of that, it's not that this tells you like how the entirety of that army is composed, nor how the troops would have been deployed. And there are lots of problems, especially about the latter aspect that I'm working on right now, an article. I will publish it in English. Who knows if some of you will recognize me next year. Is tremendously complicated. It's an enormous critical exercise, and of course also a deeply analytical one that takes a long time just to be accomplished, that practically nobody carries out. You would actually imagine that battles like this one, or other famous ones, not just of the Italian Middle Ages, but say of the 13th century, is really the peak of the great medieval civilization, also as far as warfare is concerned, are satisfactorily reconstructed, and that more or less we know, also compared to like what was happening across Europe. There isn't really such humus, there isn't really such academic, say, plan to stand on, right? We have extremely few people that even come close to study diachronically and comparatively the art of war this time, had they ever existed, by the way, satisfactorily, and there is no sign of the situation to be improving. On the contrary, with hyper-specialization, the entire sense of having a comprehensive understanding, dominance of the entire picture is being hopefully lost, right? It's not that you couldn't really have it. So I hope that with my videos we also get a bit into this type of culture, into this sort of, in the times, like in this video, in the spirits of these worlds, because without them you really don't have much of a chance to understand why a military engagement is worth of so much attention, and what sort of world you can discover behind that. And then again, we will surely at some point make a video about probably the analysis of the sources of the Battle of Montaperti for tactical reconstruction. That is, again, what I specialize in for a living, and that is a more complicated thing. It also takes, in fact, quite some work. Now, here we're looking at, and I will mostly stick to this for this video, essentially a provincial dimension. Not that there was, in fact, a regional or an international one within which the struggle between Florence and Siena can be framed. But we have also to focus, in fact, on the locality of this dimension. We were talking about it recently in the video about early medieval Florence and how it was starting to develop and become aggressive in the district, like the control over the Via Francigena, so the one that connected England, France with Rome, was a major deal, right? This crossed Tuscany, and these two cities, Florence in the north, Siena in the south, were struggling over the control of such a route. Financial rivalries, as we will see, but also centuries-old animosities between this very fragmented Tuscan district that was starting to compact in a truly subtle sense, right? The communes had emerged essentially from the late 11th, the beginning of the 12th century, struggling against the rural nobility, the ancient feudal class, also essentially integrating this in the within the city walls, and in fact, here the knights, the cavalry of the Italian communes, albeit based on census, was also largely reflecting that social extraction and legacy. The Tuscan communes are actually a bit more popular in nature, so that they actually also rise a bit later. They are a bit less socially stratified. The Lombard ones, for example, had been more hierarchical. They were also somehow more orderly. They had an older history of military alliances and coordination during the wars of the Lombard League that had just ended, by the way. The Lombard League remained as a formal organization, by the way. It's not to be found really in Tuscany. In Tuscany, there is people obsessed with geopolitics would say it's because it's all hills, right? There's not that sort of tidier flat land, right? The single Po River watershed with all the districts neatly arranged on either banks. Here, the cities are mostly of Roman origin, but they had also a bit of a bumpier time in terms of settlement development and actual origins. And in fact, they're much more truly, let's say, medieval in the construction of the local district. This is extremely important. There is a great Roman legacy, there is a great Lombard legacy. At this point, the 13th century was reviving heavily, especially in Italy, classicism, and as far as England, there were people that were looking literally at the origin of the single Italian communities, the single Italian cities, now communes politically, that back into classical times, and noticing this city was founded according to this legend, to this guy, or to the Celts, to the Romans, whatever, and there is a meaning behind this that actually intertwines with the struggle between the Welfs and the Ghibellines that we will explain a bit later, and that we can look at from sorts of different perspectives, other battles, etc. I will, again, refrain here from digressing on the broader international situation, also because that sort of Welf and Ghibelline struggle, while it's really intensifying now in an ideological sense in the reign of Manfred, and it really has, as we'll see now, they bring it to radical feuds and this incredibly bloody clashes between these cities, is yet to be finalized in the sort of a more familiar sense that would occur just a few years from Montaperti. That is a great Ghibelline triumph that, as you know, will be reversed essentially by the battles of Benevent and Tagliacozzo, in which essentially southern Italy becomes, that had backed, right, in Swabian times, the central northern Ghibellines. It becomes Welf under the Angevins, and that managed to extend a partitic hegemony throughout central northern Italy, so that the Ghibellines they don't disappear, but they are sort of the weaker side, and most Italian communes will be Welf as well. And so Welfs versus Ghibellines, Montaperti, Campaldino, Montecatini, etc. These are all like names that exude Welfness and Ghibelliness at the utmost, like in the history of warfare. The Italian Middle Ages were, in fact, the very place in which the concept of Welf and Ghibelline had actually emerged to that international factional sense. Yes, the terms stem from the German royal houses at some point, both sides. The Hohenstaufen war cry was Weiblingen because of the name of their ancestral castle. The Welfen, from which Welf were, as you know, like the famous, they said they were also relatives to the Hohenstaufen. If we think about Henry the Lion, the cousin of Frederick Barbarossa, that also influenced in the lack of Saxon help to the sovereign, like the outcome of the Battle of Legnano at 1176, like this pivotal moment in which basically the imperial politics is shattered out of that defeat. The Welfen were, however, had an Italian past, right? Actually, they had come like throughout the High Middle Ages, like they originated from the Frankish world, but then they had been installed in Carolingian times in Italy, and only then, like in the following centuries, they come back to Germany, like a branch, and so that went on. Like there were other, for example, Italian families that were intertwined with the Welfen, but this belonged mostly to a feudal world. In fact, that the communes had been surpassing, and in part also integrating. There are great names, especially in Tuscany, that is, as we've seen, that fractal of great nobiliar houses that live in the countryside, and across, like the Apennine, the Tuscamilian one, there are the Guidi counts or the Montefiltro, and some of these people would become some of the most famous condottieri of the time. There are the Malaspina, for example, in the northwest of Tuscany. There are also some Roman condottieri that are very famous and powerful. There is no doubt that Tuscany and its communal urban civilization is really booming at this point. It will especially after the Angevins will reward the wealth bankers exactly from some of these centers that had prepaid the money for the crusade against Manfred, and in fact that had rewarded such support with the Tuscan subcontraction of the grain exports from southern Italy, that at this point, as we've seen in the videos about Italian trade and economy, etc., basically exported grain all over Europe and even North Africa, etc. It's a complete reverse. It gives you an idea of the literal booming of the economy and how sort of like the humanism, the Renaissance even stem from these very centers that could be very different in many ways. Siena, for example, was a bit more archaic, rude, primitive. While the Florentines had Giotto, in Siena there was still almost a Byzantine style. And so you can understand from this differences that to some may appear neglectable if you are amazed just at the sheer level of civilization that these centers had achieved compared to other European ones. Just know that the local differences, the local divide, the local municipalism were so insisted, like something in such a radically violent ideology. Just battles like Montaperti really can't fully picture to the extent. And this is also like the prehistory of, say, Dante's culture, for example, of many other figures that inspired his work. In fact, even the name in the intro, as you know, is taken from Dante's, judgment, acknowledgement of Montaperti's bloodshed, right? One of his fatherland, by the way. So I don't need to introduce the Welfs and the Ghibellines, who respectively championed the secular authority of the church and advocated for imperial rights. What is important here is understanding that the struggle between this Florence and Siena, the major Tuscan centers at this point, really means like control for over Tuscany as a whole. And again, as we've seen, the Via Francigena, all the growing, the thriving communities, this newly rising region. And that was already important, of course, in the previous centuries, not, for example, as militarily, and so in this sense dangerously developed as Lombardy. Between the say those who would support really the papacy itself, and for example, like in this context of weakness of the empire, at least in Central Europe, and this great prominence and power actually instead of Manfred of Sicily, the legitimate son and royal successor of Frederick II in southern Italy. This was really relevant because, as you know, the clash, I made a couple of videos about this, between the papacy and Frederick II ideologically had literally, say, skyrocketed. Nothing would be as intense as actually the one at the time of Manfred, and that was also excommunicated at some point. And there are, again, enormous, we will have to talk about him more, right, to understand the scale of his power and, in fact, the extension of Sicilian control. For example, the German mercenaries that the Swabian used in this also Tuscan context. We will see that how, for example, German mercenaries are a constant in Italian warfare, actually much earlier than this. It's a bit an overlooked topic. Most people focused on the later soldiers of fortune. Definitely there was a moment of unprecedented spread of German mercenaries, especially after the Hohenfahrt of Henry VII at the beginning of the 14th century in the peninsula. But already at this point, as we'll notice now, like these incredibly brutal, violent, primitive, and incredibly efficient Central European knights were sort of the spearhead of the Italian armies that had their own good knights, but somehow lacked that level, in fact, of still of Teutonic fury that surely like had a great continuity also from the migration here, and that's yet another thing that we tend to forget in general. As we've seen, Italian warfare was radically advanced, right, and the level of especially of bellicosity, right, of actual resources invested in warfare, the tactical developments. Here we can't even trace too much because, again, the Battle of Montaperti would be such a great puzzle to solve, but we simply don't have the information. But this is a transitional phase, like from the sort of two separated phalanxes of cavalry and infantry that operate more or less separately, and the so-called wing tactics that witnessed like multiple cavalry lines in battle lines in depth, regularly flanked by infantry units. And the battles of the War of the Lombard League are sort of over. For Salta, you have the last big deal with the Bolognese infantry like charging against the entire army of Heinz, the king of Sardinia. And then you basically land at Campaldino in 1289, where you really have this fully fledged like wing tactic that you find, by the way, immediately developed already in places like, I don't know, Romagna, were all politically fragmented, and so you understand that basically all Italians, also from the later generations, fought this really unparalleled type of collectively trained armies. Like in the rest of Europe, there is none of this as far as infantry development is concerned, but properly like the collective performance together with cavalry, the missile dimension, it's really shocking how sort of advanced they really had become, even though more or less European tactics were all the same. The intensity that these have in Italy is really shocking, and it's probably one of, if not the single most underestimated aspect in the history of medieval warfare, probably medieval art of war. But going back to the Welf-Ghibelline divide, and without digressing further on what this could really mean, even in terms of actual belief, I shall make videos explaining the actual traditional point of why was there the struggle. It's not a simple struggle between the empire and the papacy just per se. There is more at least behind this more simplistic expression. In fact, people often reason as if like Welf and Ghibelline, the Welf and Ghibelline division was clear cut, right? Rooted on, let's say, in just ideological and principled motivations, as if someone was just Welf or Ghibelline, depending on merely what they actually believed. There was actually a much more homogeneous traditional background that we tend to forget. And then there were some sort of other political contingencies why you would back at this point this side or another. And much of this conflict, of course, laid not even much concealed, right, in the deep-seated local rivalries that played an equally crucial role in determining allegiance to one factor or another, right? The Italian communes had been founded as communities of freemen, and so to that degree of noblemen in arms, right? The entire point of the communal identity, this is where we often describe them as mercantile republics, but the sole objective, like the manifestation of their greater pride and identity and role in the world was in warfare, in the fact that they bore arms and that this community had been created essentially for the sake of this, right, and conquering, asserting their control on their district, as a matter of fact. And in 13th century Tuscany, of course, there is the struggle between the Guelph-dominated Florence and Ghibelline Siena, of course, comes from the sum of these sort of provincial interests and competition between the centers that were leading essentially the hinterland, especially of Tuscan development. And that also, interestingly enough, will actually place them in a few generations on the same side, right? Both Florence and Siena from the end of the 13th century are essentially Guelph, and Siena will also fight and spill a lot of blood next to Florence in some of the fiercest fights, especially ones that, like in fact, from the end of the 13th to beginning of the 14th century. But just this decades before, witness a different situation. Now, Florence harbored lofty ambitions and pursued her goals with greater fervor than her rivals through an aggressive strategy aimed properly at neighboring cities. This was new in Tuscany. Like in Lombardy, the entire deal why, for example, Frederick Barbarossa had descended is that there were some cities like Lodi that were very pressed by the Milanese expansionism. That was something completely new, right? Up to this point, like and still, even after generations, it would be rare, if not impracticable for an Italian city to conquer another, right? Eventually, especially from the first half of the 14th century, things changed. But in medieval history, in the first place, you don't find in any other a country a city that actually conquers another, because other countries are fundamentally ruled by princes and and archbishops. There is not much of a sort of urban military development that allows these the communes that exist also, of course, in other countries to simply dictate rule in their in their surroundings and being even able to take over another city. Right, they're always beaten by some feudal overlord. The Italians, for many reasons, have, like, first of all, a massive urban legacy from Roman times. They are incredibly civilized. They also enjoy this decentralized position. They are incredibly wealthy, and they, of course, want to defend their prerogatives. So, as you know, like the wars of the Lombard League that had left Tuscany very relatively unscathed, had been proving this, right? And what a better situation than the interregnum, just to let these ambitions loose, by the way. In particular, Florence, as we said before, sought to gain control of Via Francigena, this crucial trade route connecting northern Europe to Rome and southern Italy, much of which, however, in its course, was under Siena's jurisdiction. In other words, it passed through the Sienese countryside and also through the one of other towns that basically had been subsumed, had been part of the Sienese, at least, sphere of influence. The context and reasons why Florence was supporting the papacy, and of course the papacy was supporting her, are also complicated essentially Florence was north enough to, and as the biggest Tuscan, the most promisingly rising Tuscan center, for the papacy to sponsor it in the region, right, betting on it. There were more traditionally Ghibelline centers, such as Pisa, that in her maritime power had been sort of very unprejudiced and often sort of, in fact, backing and being backed by the emperor, and sort of destabilizing southern Italy. That was at least tendentially what the papacy also wanted to control, in spite of the fact of the clash with the Hohenstaufen in the last generations, because it was seen as it had been created as a kingdom, as a vassal of the papacy specifically. Also, the papacy had a particular issue with southern Tuscany. It technically belonged to the Metropolitic See of Rome, but had never been, since Longobards times, politically, secularly under her control. Siena lay in there and was also close to Rome. It sort of was more directly controlling, in fact, the major routes to the Holy City, to the Urbs. And so, tendentially, right, this is not about Siena or Florence per se, right, because being a Welf or Ghibelline is a matter of what kind of faction you are within the city gates, right? And so, of course, there were Ghibelline as Welf Florentines, as much as Welf as Ghibelline Sienese, right? So it was about backing this party or another, and this came through sort of different means, right? Later on, I don't know, Rudolf of Habsburg, that will, even as king of the Romans, never descend into Italy, would, for example, send some couple of hundred Burgundian mercenary knights to Arezzo against Florence, just because. And the interesting thing being that Arezzo sent these guys back because, as Burgundians, even though they came from the Holy Roman Empire, this meant Burgundians in local sources being essentially Lorrainese, a bit like the Luxembourgs later on. Since they were associated with the French, they spoke French, they seemed too Welf, too Angevin for their tastes, and they sent them back. At least this is what the chronicles tell us. And in fact, there was this aware, at least at this point, the French were not so involved in Italy yet. It will happen in that heavy fashion in a few years, but of course, there was also historically, as you know, a different attitude. At least Frederick II had been saved by the French at Bouvines in his Sicilian throne, and also the German one. And so at that point you had a sort of French, at least not, you can say German, because at that point the actual German ruler was in fact out of Brunswick, a Welf. And so you understand how really complicated it is and how these divisions really apply to basically every single place. And you can't make that sort of clear cut. I don't know, Florence had decided one day to be Welf for some reason, without mentioning that when you look at Welfism, you don't really see the degree of ideological and doctrinal belief that instead does really exist in the Ghibelline field, right? The Ghibelline tradition was really the sort of more, in fact, historical, obvious one that also the Welfs sort of understood. Like, they didn't reject imperial authority at all, per se. But again, the interests at stake were beyond, in fact, these mere labels to some point, and one must understand it in the incredibly, again, complicated political background. We'll have to make, of course, lots, because here I'm simplifying dramatically the entire picture, but we must start from something. But something more about the local politics is really, really necessary. In any case, the Florentine Republic's proceedings, as far as Tuscany was concerned, were about seizing every opportunity to incite revolts within the Sienese sphere of influence, especially in smaller yet proud communes like Montalcino and Montepulciano, both of which had a Guelph majority but were controlled by Siena. The Florentines and the Sienese had this sort of frontier area in between, right? In the Chianti area, for example, famous for wine, etc. But even the wealth of the countryside would produce this actual stuff, right? The Parmesans would find for their cheese, and other cities for their ham or whatever. They weren't characterized really like that, but the countryside is incredibly fertile, incredibly productive, and that is really what fuels, what supplies the city logistically, right? So if you damage the countryside, if you unhinge all these supply chains, you can really cause devastating damage to the city. But they're largely also inconclusive wars because it's really hard, right, even just to properly knock out your rival, right? You can't do it more easily in this factional sense than to making the regime change within the city than knocking out the city. Here, Montaperti's campaign is something else, because basically the Florentines, as you will see, will want actually to besiege the same Siena. And so this is a great act of arrogance and hubris, but still something that could be done. That Florence starts having really the material resource of achieving. It wasn't like Siena was a weak commune at all. Now, these Florentine incursions into southern Tuscany, the Sienese side, posed a direct threat, in fact, to the city of the wolf, by the way. Florence is the city of the lily, as we've seen in the origins of ancient Florence, whereas Siena has the she-wolf, right, as symbol. We talk about this in the Sienese history video. And in particular, the threat was posed to the Sienese dominance over the Via Francigena, and as well as her alliance with the region's primary Ghibelline ally, Grosseto. Grosseto lays in southwestern Tuscany on the Tyrrhenian Sea, and the reason why the city was so important is that it was essentially the most viable center that, with adequate political manipulation, could allow Florence with an actual port. Florence, again, was heading to be the richest city in the world without having access to the sea. Of course, the Florentines, as we'll see, as the Sienese, were bankers also, and they could simply buy, right? Just they would have a draw financially that allowed them all this, let's say, traffics to reach her anyway. And by essentially infesting the Sienese countryside and one of these other communes that backed Siena, Florence realized that they could unhinge the Sienese control, and if Grosseto in particular had become Guelph, there could have been an independent route to the sea that Florence could and would use. In fact, when Siena became Guelph, later on, and she was allied with Florence, most of the imports came from there. Grosseto is not much of a large commune at all. It would have been more natural for Florence to ask Pisa, but as we well know, this was Ghibelline, and controlling the mouth of the Arno River, over which, say, up river Florence lays, that's not really, practicable, and it will not be for a long time. In fact, the peasants will also beat the hell out of the Florentines. Florentines collect an unfortunate series of defeats routinely from these different neighbors. The only ones that they beat it severely, still almost losing the battle, was at Campaldino, and we will see that too at some point. Now, furthermore, a single strategic move by Florence could also grant her access to the sea itself. As we were just hinting at, another critical arena of competition between Florence and Siena was the financial sector, where both cities distinguished themselves as some of Italy's most capable and enterprising bankers. During the Middle Ages, this meant they were among the most significant banking entities in Europe and the world. I made multiple videos about this Italian financial hegemony and how it sort of lasted for centuries, as far as being the literal pivot of the entire Western economy that in turn dominated the entire Europe and the entire Mediterranean, even more faraway markets. And again, what is interesting first, Florentine and Sienese bankers traveled also far, but these are not maritime republics. Siena does not really have an access in her countryside on the sea either, right? But this tells you like also how structured and compact like the financial banking net was really at this time. By this time, because although banking was a relatively new endeavor, the competition in this field was already intense, right? There was a lot to gain from investing in it, and was fueled by these enormous profits that were anticipated to rise further. I made a video that explains exactly how public debt functioned in Italian communes, and you immediately understand that the entire deal of this enormous profits and expenses was war, right? The armies that the Italian communes mobilized were massive, right? And especially they were repeatedly operating, right? Already, like in a couple of decades, Florence will have 2 different armies on campaign on a single season, right? They have the same size of Milan as what was historically like the most powerful commune in Italy. And the relationship between the Sienese and the Florentines was marked not only by the significant political and economic differences, but also by a deep-seated animosity that today we could describe as ethnic almost. Like what is very interesting in the Italian vocabulary of the time is how like the term foreigner is applied to like literally anyone living in another city, right? And actually when these oldest merchants, Italian merchants are abroad, they do identify as Tuscan, as Lombards. And abroad they are known as such, but when they are in Italy, they hate each other guts because of this local divisions that we can't find like properly a contemporary parallel only in, say, ethno-nationalistic, say, cleansing or something like that. Of course, like it's a bit different from that because these people knew, of course, that they were the same people, actually. They spoke the same language and they were part of the same civilization that was even, by the way, extremely compact, extremely homogeneous. The Italian communes all developed politically, militarily, institutionally in the same exact years, which is amazing. And in fact, there was a pretty shared also, like, sort of vernacular literature. Some of the greatest geniuses, in fact, of the era were born in these warring city-states and participating to these very battles. So it's very difficult sometimes to explain this, but of course, when you understand how much was at stake locally in terms of power, wealth, you really understand why this hatred was so strong, right? And of course, much of this went beyond the city. The Welf and Ghibelline bond, for example, was very much also connected with that. There were social divides. There were, as we've seen, like the city and the rural nobility, but they also sort of lived in the same places. Like those guys had their own house towers in the same Florence. So it's all incredibly stratified, right? And Florence asserted her superiority by ideally claiming a Roman heritage. As we've seen, she was the city of the Lily of Flora, but also of Mars, right? And this led them, and the reason why the Florentines were doing was a sort of proto-humanism, right? So the idea of classical era revival, literacy. Florence was already a great cultural center, and it was the idea that instead the more primitive cities like Siena, that was actually also very advanced, but also a bit more the Apenninic ones like Arezzo, etc., were a bit more barbaric to some degree, and they were associated for this reason to the actual barbarians of the migration era, to the Germans, to the Longbird, for example. It turns out a few decades from now that while the Florentines had a hairstyle with a fringe that was mimicking the French Angevin fashion, that, as we've seen, it's something that even develops as far as the local panoply is concerned. There is probably a Tuscan, Angevin, Provençal military style that you can find iconographically, archaeologically, but the one with Cuir with warhead. We have seen it in the videos about Central Northern Italian warfare, but instead the Aretines thought that this was, first of all, like the Florentine one was an effeminated fashion, because this sense of international, it's as if they had been against globalism, right? And they had been against this sort of rampant modernity that distracted the individual from the more traditional lifestyle. And the Aretines wore beards, which, if you consider that some of these areas had been heavily Longobardized, at some point you realize that it was really an ethnic mark of some sort of higher ancestral traditional, say, very older, say historically older mark. The myth of Rome and its classicism was already meta-historical. Of course, it was very traditional, and the Florentines abided by the same sort of traditional principles as we were saying. But these little differences make you understand how important for them they were. The exasperation of these differences is almost a mania, right? And it stems from the fact that they all believed that their respective city was the best one, that they were the best men, that they got it all, and that the others were cowards, and this had to be proven in battlefield. And that's exactly what it was all about. It was an extremely violent war. You were brought up into them. You would normally, the Italian citizenry and peasantry were heavily militarized. They were regularly, as we've seen, brought into these expeditions. They were incredibly, again, vicious in terms of violence and destruction, etc. And people lived and died like that. They did so because they thought they were doing it for the right reason. They had all their, as we've seen, traditional luggage, let's say, of justifications. They went at war with sacred symbols. They had their arms blessed on the church altars. They were fanatically devoted to their respective city's saint, and so all of this takes on extremely important dimensions that you can also and mostly admire in the beautiful art that, of course, it's very easy to use for videos like this. And so the idea is that the Siennese would have had some sort of barbarian origins as opposite to that, and it was a bit of a, just a provocation. It's not that the Siennese were sort of even went back in this idea, were doing so because they really thought of themselves as barbarians or descending more from, as we'll see now, the Gauls or the Germans. But it was a way to provoke the enemy, to sort of create an image of themselves. This is incredibly important. In fact, Siena notoriously boasts a rich Etruscan history. But you see, as I was saying before, this Italian factionalism was so international that even the 12th century scholar John of Salisbury in England noted several similarities between the Siennese, he said, and his fellow Englishmen. Why? Because he attributed, in this sort of Arthurian mentality stemming from the British Isles, the connections to the legendary founding of Siena by Brennus. That's not how it happened, really, but this was, of course, the king of the Senones Gauls in northern central Italy during his very campaign against Rome in 390 BC. Medievals did that, right? It's just like, I don't know, the English that said they descended from the Trojans, the Normans at least, and the Scots said consequently they descended from the Achaeans that even destroyed Troy for that matter. And of course the Trojan connection was with Rome. So you understand how actually vivid this classical legacy really was. And of course, if Siena had been founded by Brennus, again, which is not true, but Brennus had destroyed Rome and the Florentines were all about Rome currently, that's another story, right? For example, Pisa was traumatically and violently Roman, self-identifying city in the Middle Ages. And the Romanity in that sense stemmed to from the loyalty to, not just because Pisa was sort of very advanced, city with connections with also Constantinople historically, but because it backed the Holy Roman Emperor, right? And so, of course, there was this ambiguity between like having been part Germanized historically, part having been Roman ethnically, and sort of mixing these universals as poles of the universe, a bit like the saying Welfs and Ghibellines. And it's obviously very interesting here that the Ghibellines are also a bit more like Celto-Germanically, characterized in a almost romantic way, whereas the Guelphs inspired themselves more to Rome because of the papacy. But as we've seen, Siena has the symbol of the she-wolf, and Florence also has actually a Longbard Frankish past that the same chroniclers, as we were observing in the last videos, were proud of. So that's how sort of crazy it gets, but it is actually extremely logical in the way it was used politically at the time, right? It's just us were too ignorant about those words at times to understand what it meant, but to them it was that important. It would literally get themselves killed, in part at least, also for it. And besides the linguistic ties connecting Siena to the Senones, by the way, Siena Senones, even though they have, again, nothing to do with each other etymologically, there are also references to the passage of the Gauls in the names of various local places, such as Fontebranda, for example, which is true, actually, a village known as Brenna, for example, the area of Gallena, and the town of Gallico, among others. And that is true, because, of course, we tend to underestimate how strong Celtic presence was not just in northern, but also in central Italy. Of course, Tuscany was the Etruscan heartland, but many etymologists, like, say, words, etc., you can say that it's very strong here. There are also a bit like Roman names that were attributed for some reason, but with Celtic origins themselves. And I always stress how the second Latin declension is identical to the Gallic one, right? So these were cousins. But it's, again, extremely interesting how this very often very highly learned citizens, but also knights and sort of thinkers, polymaths, right, participating to these clashes, the Italian communes were actually interested in this mysterious symbolism. Additionally, the Sienese dialect contained, and this is true, a higher number of terms of Lombard origin compared to the Florentine dialect. And this did happen because the area of Tuscia was much more sort of Germanized during the Middle Ages than certain other areas of that were more urbanized, and so maintaining more Romanity in a sense. Right, so it's extremely powerful. Like the entire area, for example, north of Rome, southern Tuscany, along the Tiber Valley, the Apennines, is heavily Longobardized. The area of Spoleto, we've seen it as well. Well, if you look at the context of Montaperti, we're looking at exactly the same communities that sent, as we'll see now, contingents also to one another. Was already here a lot of interregionalism as far as alliances were concerned. And these people lived, if you want, in the wake of the same lifestyle and tradition of honor, pride, violence, fighting that had always been there since the Longobards feuds, and sort of also before, if you look at the militarization of the late Roman cities, for example, you would be probably surprised. Now, tensions between Florence and Siena gradually intensified until in 1258, Siena breached an agreement made 3 years prior. In fact, in 1255, the Sienese, having suffered defeat in a war against Florence, were forced to sign a peace treaty that included a clause promising not to shelter Ghibellines or common criminals exiled from Florence, Montalcino, and Montepulciano. This provision is particularly relevant because, as we've seen in other videos about the Italian communes, the conflicting cities were used to essentially host the political exiles of their foes to essentially subsidize them, to back them, to reinfiltrate the ancestral district where they normally held also large estates and castles, so posing further problems to the enemy commune, sort of trying to destructure its countryside. Siena had to back down at that point because she had been heavily defeated. But of course, she knew that things would change as well, and that this pact would be difficult to uphold. As Siena had already previously committed in 1251 to support the Florentine Ghibellines by offering them sanctuary within her walls in times of crisis. And this is again what would normally happen in the first place. The Florentines were just dictating conditions to humiliate their rivals and wanting especially the exiles back to punish them while they were escaping all around. Now the situation escalated in 1258 when Florence expelled yet another considerable number of Ghibellines, including the famous Farinata degli Uberti and his family. This was one of the greatest knights and warriors of his times, and an incredibly famous figure because of Dante's Inferno, right? And we will talk more about him. He's a bit like the hero of Montaperti. His name was actually, this was a nickname stemming from the fact that his hair was platinum blonde, and the Uberti were one of the single most powerful and aristocratically, militarily equine feudal clans, of noble clans of some sort. And in fact, they were connected with the Ghibelline authority. They were subsidized by Manfred of Sicily. So they're really like the those. You see, Farinata is damned in hell because of condemnation for Epicureanism, which was another way in the Middle Ages to say that you were basically a determinist of some sort, or a materialist and a heretic, right, that did not believe in God. These accusations were completely false. Eventually, like at least his remains would have a sad end, but it really just talked about the incredibly vicious ideological struggle that was taking place also against the over the political enemies, and these were pious Christians that had very high name to respect also as far as it. And so these accusations were just an infamy to stain the name of these clans, and together with the razing of their house towers and the persecution of especially their male members. And Farinata is really the central figure, seeking refuge in Siena as stipulated by the agreement. The city ultimately chose to disregard her commitment to Florence in favor of her earlier obligations. Farinata was too much of an important guy, and of course the Sienese would warmly welcome him. You see, he was Florentine, so probably they didn't like each other at all, but since they were all Ghibellines at the moment, they would cooperate. Now the Florentines quickly resumed hostilities as a consequence by launching a series of devastating cavalry raids into Sienese territory. This was the most common practice of Italian warfare at the time. And the Florentines historically would establish further mounted service demanded from the citizens, that however could also pay somebody else to force somebody else to go fight in their stead, the famous cavallate. And there was also a mark of knighthood connected with that, but the level of militarization of these communities is very high, and there are always new ways, like to impose, especially the military service that is very demanding. But at this point, like, these communities are also ramping up; they're mounting up in wealth and power. And this, raids were only the beginning. A far more dangerous strategy for Siena was unfolding in the city of the Lily. The conflict particularly intensified in Maremma, where Florence incited revolts in Grosseto, Montiano, and Montemassi, all in that coastal region, successfully turning these areas to the Guelph coast and making considerable strides towards the long-sought conquest of all of southern Tuscany. Naturally, Florence will take an awfully long time just to achieve this in historical hindsight, but at the time they thought they could do it. And there are all these dormant cells that, as you've seen, can reactivate, siding with the Welf coast, also within the Sienese Ghibelline sphere of influence. All society was divided to some extent, and there was a lot of money there at stake. A lot of people were co-opted, bribed. They all had reasons. Also some of the highest, the noble, the principal ones that we said before, but never separating completely. Now, fully aware of the gravity of the situation, Siena sought assistance from the King of Sicily, Manfred, the aforementioned son of Emperor Frederick II of Swabia, who had recently assumed leadership of the Ghibelline faction in Italy. Manfred was incredibly powerful. Siena told him, look, they are essentially sabotaging also our own supply lines from the sea, and also, in fact, the connection that existed with Sicily, and that send us some troops, and we will basically deal with it effectively. So Siena secured in this way an initial small contingent of 100 German mercenary knights. All right, Manfred worked with these. Also, his late father had essentially headed towards that direction. The Siculo-Normans had actually one of the single most efficient armies and recruitment systems, but since the crisis of the Swabians, like the death of Henry VI, the minority of Frederick II, and all the wars that had been fought, the increasing monetization of warfare, by the way, also in this sense, had unhinged the feudal system, the structures, and basically like these southern Italian armies revolved around this nucleus of mercenary knights, especially the German ones were that prized. I mean, Manfred didn't really have much of a connection with Germany, if not, say, in a broader political sense. But the Germans would flock to his court, the one of such powerful, magnificent ruler, and they would simply be at his service. And by the way, 100 of them were adequate for the Sienese political aims, right? Of course, 100 knights here, like Siena had an army of her own, and of course these mercenaries were integrated together with others, by the way, other Italians, Tuscans, to operate. But they really were like spearheading the formation. They were insignificant as far as the balance power shift among the contenders here. It's not about these 100 knights that the entire system would change, but right, based on the broader size of the Sienese armies, we will see these guys will have a crucial role at Montaperti, and much of the Sienese victory will really be their merit. The German knights, as we'll see them now, were specialists in mounted warfare, but in a sort of heroic, like either as literally chargers, like they would throw themselves into the fray, like cutting through anyone, even in sort of a suicidal function, or they were incredibly well sort of timed and reliable for carrying out major surrounding maneuvers and falling on the enemy flank in the least expected moment. This is incredibly important. These men were they were attracted again by all the Italian bellicosity and the wealth of the local rulers. So they were quite happy of serving. As we'll see, they would be paid adequately for their services. It was clear that once Manfred committed to this clash between Florence and Siena, there would be no turning back, by the way, about the general, siding. And so all the other cities in central Italy had to basically pick their own, right? Indeed, Manfred's support for the Ghibelline coalition formed to aid Siena grew to include 800 knights and 2,000 infantry. And that were, sent at different times from southern Italy, and that were mostly, meant to effect go full 800 knights to tame Tuscany. Again, too few, even if they're Germans, but they still do something. They're still an important force that at this point is also quite high. They cost a lot, right? These cities are very rich, but we're still talking about the 13th century. There is a structural burden there. Only 250 German knights were enough to provide the Sienese army with the strength needed to reclaim the 3 Maremma communes in the early months of 1260. These were smaller towns. You can imagine all the kind of infight. Sometimes you would march into them even without needing to storm to storm the walls. Like they would open, like there would be somebody opening the gates, or you simply swarm in and massacring. And again, the Germans were particularly bloodthirsty and brutally efficient in the most stereotypically barbaric fashion. I'm not kidding. We know it very well from an astonishingly large amount of evidence in these Italian chronicles. The Italians weren't tender-hearted at all. They did some of the most viciously violent things, but apparently there was something about these Germans that captivated as far as their literal fury and brutality that was sort of unseen. Indeed, Germany was much more of a feudal, privatized country. Germany does not really have an identifiable eastern frontier. There had always been fighting against Magyars and Mongols, and in a sense the Italians were also a bit like the antithesis, especially the Welfs, to the Roman and German at the same time identity that had been developing. Remember that the German knights at the Battle of Markfeld would shout as their war cry, "Here's Rome." Right? Maybe there was somebody that had served in Tuscany this 18 years before. And so fighting against the Welfs was like, we will kick your ass. And this is a feeling sort of mounting up, especially after the beheading of Conradin of Swabia, the loss of Sicily. By the Angevins backing again the Welfs, and so this feud that extends to really an international scale within the Italians, within the Germans. There were divisions as far as that was concerned between Germany as well. The south was sort of tendentially more imperial. Ghibelline, the north, was a bit more countercultural in that sense. The Germans hated each other guts, possibly even worse than the Italians did among each other. After all, Germany was far more fragmented than Italy, and this is the beauty of the times, right? Even looking at how these military cultures met, and they were actually very highly efficient. I mean, if you look at this German mercenaries in the massive Italian armies of the time, you realize that they had an incredibly effective capacity, but also they were perfectly integrated into this very complex structured military system, and they acted in tandem really, really perfectly. These are some, again, the best armies in medieval warfare to begin with. So the fact that, as we've seen, Siena managed to secure back the control on the Maremman portual coastal areas, let's say, disrupted the Florentine strategy. Florence could not really intervene as far as there. As you understand now, Montaperti starts from the realization that unless you knock out Siena entirely, you can't really get it over with. And so the Florentines create an urgent need for their city, and the entire Welf faction in central Italy that was equally like sort of starting to revolve around Florence to regain the initiative in the conflict. The Ghibellines had too easily turned the tide in Maremma, a shift attributed to, as we've seen, essentially Florentine overconfidence in underestimating the enemy's ability to retaliate. This misjudgment significantly influenced the Florentine diplomatic maneuverings, which forged an alliance with the Guelphs of the republics of Lucca, close to Pisa, and in this sense quite rival against this Ghibelline center, Prato, that is in the northwest of Florence, San Gimignano, that is in fact in this low southern reality closer to the Sienese frontier, equally for San Miniato, to the German Volterra, and Colle Valdelsa. These are crucial centers because they really are like the Tuscan belt, like that Florence can use against Siena. But support comes also from other cities, such as Orvieto and Perugia in Umbria, and Bologna in Emilia, across the Apennines. Even the Lombard League actually supports Florence at this point, because they were fundamentally sort of anti-Ghibelline still at this point. The later Lombard League, hegemonized by the Visconti, for example, will be essentially a Ghibelline power. But at this point, if they could, and they would fight against Manfred, the Hohenstaufen, like things would work. By late May, a formidable Welf army arrived at the gates of Siena. We are in 1260, right? And this force was poised to besiege the city. Right, Siena is big, right? Again, it's a massive enterprise to undertake. In fact, this bold move, fueled by a strong desire for revenge, left the Welf encampment vulnerable to persistent attacks from the Sienese forces and German mercenaries. In other words, yes, the Florentines had projected this massive strategic force at the gates of Siena, but this meant, of course, that they were suffering more logistically, that the Sienese countryside could infest them with hit-and-run tactics and guerrilla warfare, straining the Guelph supply lines. And as a result of this earlier miscalculation, the Guelph army lifted the siege on May the 20th, 1260, and retreated to Florence, providing the Ghibellines an opportunity to address the remaining threats in southern Tuscany. This was the season, particularly by focusing their force on Montalcino, a strategic hub located on a hilltop along the Via Francigena. Montalcino, as we will see also from the history of Florence, already seen from the historical regional series, recurs. However, the conflict for Florence was only postponed, and within the same season. In fact, on September the 2nd, a formidable Welf army, consisting of 3,000 knights and 30,000 infantry, re-emerged near Siena. Right? This is a massive force. They sent an embassy to the city, proposing humiliating terms for peace, which the government body known as the 24, that was essentially the Sienese city senate, refused. I don't digress on sort of the Republican profile of these communes. Of course, the fact that these rulers were the most affluent, powerful houses of the city, the ones that control like all the military clienteles as well. They had their own fortified palaces and estates in the countryside. Countryside was being now ravaged by the Florentines as well. So this is a massive onslaught that Siena has to face. And the sense here of Florence desiring battle and the Sienese having the honor and the capacity to accept it is really the key. in fact, being passively besieged by the Florentines, in spite of the enormous logistical strains, would have sort of deprived the Siennese this chance to annihilate the Florentine army, and may have, in fact, made them lose at some point, like even the possibility of meeting them in open field. So they knew better, politically and strategically, what to do. The Florentines were sure of this themselves, in fact, anticipating the armed clash. The Welf army set up camp approximately 7 kilometers east of Siena's walls on the high ground overlooking the plain of the Courtains, as it's called, nestled between the Arbia and Biena rivers. This strategic location allowed the Welf camp to be flanked by both waterways, providing a favorable position over their adversaries during battle. Essentially, they had the higher ground. The Ghibelline forces comprised 8,000 infantry from Siena, 3,000 from Pisa, 2,000 additional infantry, and 800 German knights under King Manfred, along with 1,300 soldiers from Cortona, that is a city in Tuscany bordering Umbria, that also participated. Siena had a great connection with all sort of the southern Tuscan world that was also still a heavily feudalized area where the Counts of Santa Fiora, for example, that in many ways also infested the Sienese countryside, but in many ways they could count on forces that, as we've seen, were a bit more brutally primitive as traditional and warlike, and the same Sienese contrada could provide with solid knights that really knew their deal. Furthermore, you have to count 5,000 men joining from the Florentine exiles, right? As well as other Ghibellines from Terni, in Umbria, known as the most zealous Ghibelline city in Italy, by the way. And these smaller towns of the Apennines often, again, were incredibly Ghibelline in many ways. Asciano, the aforementioned Santa Fiora, and Arezzo. There was also, like, along the Arno Valley, that enemy of Florence. So in total, the Ghibelline army consisted of approximately 1,600 knights and 20,000 infantry. Remember, the Welfs, Florentines, had 3,000 knights and 30,000 infantry. Despite facing a numerical disadvantage, morale in Siena was exceptionally high. Right? The 800 German mercenary knights were particularly enthusiastic and were offered double their monthly pay upfront. Right? So they were very motivated, very angry against the Welfs for their successes against their emperors, and they really were anxious just to prove themselves as men, as warriors in the fray, which is the most exciting thing one can imagine, of course. On the morning of that fatidic September the 4th, the Ghibellines left Siena in 4 divisions. The 2 largest ones positioned themselves against the Guelphs. A third one, comprising 200 knights, several hundred infantrymen, and armed priests as well, made a video about the German warrior bishops, but as you understand here, these Italian priests weren't kidding either. And that's part of that southern Tuscan, Maremman, Longobard almost sort of vibe, stayed in the rear guard to protect the carroccio. The carroccio, as you know, is a wheel cart that normally bears like the symbols, not much of the city actually, but of the people, right? It's more of a chthonic symbol, but of course it's connected, like any of these universitates or any community that corporatistically and organically, in fact, makes up the body of traditional communities, has their own genus, their own numen, right? And so the carroccio is there for the people, but it's as if a bit like the knights, the noblemen looked at it and said, you know what, yes, these are just damn third, fourth estators, but they are our third and fourth estators of Siena. That municipal feeling really was that strong. Normally mentioned the Carroccio for the Battle of Legnano, where the Lombard infantry resisted the German cavalry charges until their own cavalry crushed the Barbarossa. But the Carroccio was really used. Regarding the German warrior bishop, actually was a cart specifically was used. Leave aside the Teutonic knights that went at war with organons, singing Marian hymns, etc. But in general, this was a sort of more widespread thing than we often think. Every community had something to boast, a gonfalon, something that they would die by. Right? The idea is that you die around the Carroccio, you defend that with your life, or you're not a human being, which seems wholly legitimate, by the way. And then there is this fourth and final unit consisting of 200 German knights, as well as an equal number of crossbowmen, taking concealed routes to approach the rear of the Guelphs' left flank, ready to execute a surprise attack at the most opportune moment. This was a concealed reserve, essentially, that, as you understand here, it's not even just about cavalry. The idea is that it would have been made up of... it was just like a smaller battle line, right? You have here the core of the 200 German knights that are very elite and very good for this task, but they're followed by crossbowmen that are, generally speaking, a bit more semi-professional, professional. This would have been German, or actually Italian, plus some infantry, right? Normally the German knights serve only as mercenaries. It's extremely rare to even find a single mention of infantrymen amongst them. Compared to in this Italian context, consider that the reason why there were so many Germans around, as we were saying, is that during the Interregnum, princes start taking over. The ministerialis class is, first of all, it's being equated to the rest of the knights that are collectively sinking a bit in that power. So many of them go abroad, and they, given that Italy is as neighboring and just close at hand with this, as you understand, high pay and chance to fight, that's the most obvious destination. For these Germans, by the way, never sort of settle down. It's not that they create a fief or whatever. Italy is not really a land of conquest, if not maybe in southern Italy because of the feudal system that allowed this or that nobleman to be installed at their place. But it's not anymore, at least in as much as that feudal dimension does not exist. And many of them actually come back to Germany. So it would be very, very, very interesting to see how many, German knights from other German battles of later times, we were mentioning Markfeld, had been fighting in Italy, for example, which was really a hell of a military school, military class to take. And again, this reserve must be very, very good, right? They must... their leader must understand the exact moment where to attack on the enemy flank, doing it remaining concealed until the right moment the battle lines clash in the adequate way, and then charging like hell and slicing through the enemy ranks. With the support, however, of still, you understand, the infantry, right? So a combined force coming asymmetrically against the flank is really devastating, right? Now, and they were entrusted with this degree of autonomous decision. So everything is at stake. And the most interesting aspect about this tactic is that it's mentioned only when it succeeds, right? And the great suspicion of mine is actually, and I also wrote about this, is that these concealed reserves were always present, and that, of course, we are told when there was as successful as was only, in fact, when they achieved what they were there for, right? Because you find them almost always, right? There is no way even to claim that in any battle they weren't present. But again, what you find written in the sources is something, what happened in reality is something else. And mostly chroniclers told you the relevant thing, like telling something so obvious, like there would be a hidden reserve here and there, like, why is it relevant, right? You don't find, literally, like, you never find, like, an example of, I don't know, there was a concealed reserve, but it failed in its intent, right? I know only one case, but out of, like, literally tens, if not hundreds of battles, in which, like, these flank attacks are very frequent, and that's also the only battle, by the way, in which you are told actually that both armies had a concealed reserve, and then one attacked and another didn't, simply went away. So it's I think quite telling overall. So the CNAs, as we've seen, had to aggress the Welf army and launch their attack with determination, though at a slow pace, which is quite considerate because you don't want to disorder the formation. The enemy has the higher ground, and you do not need to exhaust your forces with sort of more accelerated, impetuous attack. By the way, especially cavalry charges here. Cavalry was, by the way, dominant. You don't find, especially in Italy, in spite of the overwhelming infantry development, a sole infantry victory, because they would always count on their cavalry. They weren't sort of, I don't know, bourgeois rebels like in the case of Flanders, or some sort of barely stratified reality like in Scotland. Like, it didn't make any sense to fight just with infantry. But in fact, the arms are incredibly well tuned, well trained to support one another mutually, and they understand that they have to maintain cold blood, advancing till they're close to the enemy, then unleashing hell. The Welfs were also well armed, right? The Florentines had this great material wealth and held a strategically advantageous position, made their presence felt, causing the Ghibelline left flank to give ground. So we're talking literally about the same type of armies, right? There is no difference between each other. They're fighting with the same moral temper, the same material culture. Even the fact that the CNAs have 800 German knights, it's not much like the game changer here, as we'll see that it's a complex system of factors. And in fact, the Ghibelline left flank is about to give ground. By the way, today I deliberately, as I said, avoid the tactical analysis, reconstruction of the battle just through every source. We have to look at this better, because the problem is that we do not know exactly how the armies were arrayed, where cavalry was, where infantry was. Nobody really understands this. Nobody really knows this. If you look at scholarship, whichever, like every single work offers a different interpretation of the battle, at least as far as the main events are known, but how the troops were actually deployed, and so how we can connect these efforts spatially and just quantitatively, unfortunately, is not to be known. There are some iconic moments. We know more or less what happened, but again, we do not precisely know what happened, and this is unfortunate, but also really normal for the battles of the period. So this is a critical moment, right? The CNAs are going to be about to be beaten back by the Welfs, and it's at this point that only the intervention of those CNAs, Carroccio guardsmen, together with the armed priests, proved fortuitous, as they abandoned their post to support their beleaguered comrades. This is a hell of a decision, because it was, of course, forbidden to leave the Carroccio. But there is this fanatic zeal from the armed priests that sort of revives this incredibly brutal fight. When I say it's brutal, it's really brutal. According to tradition, the Ghibelline exiles from Florence recognized some of their relatives among the enemy's left wing, because they were so, as we've seen, intertwined, mixed. And these relatives had been pressured by the Florentine Guelphs to join the expedition to prevent them from inciting a revolt in the city. This is very interesting. consider that in moments of greater emergency, like some major external invasion, this would happen with Siena, for example, at the arrival of Henry VII's Germans in her countryside. It would recall all the exiles and would be compact and say we have to be united again, all as Sienese. So respiriting the forces through this. In this case, the Florentines would bring their own Ghibellines, Ghibelline Florentines into their own army, knowing that it was better to hold them in there than leaving them in the city that could be, could be taken, could be seized by them in some way. So, easiest way to change sides, these Ghibellines quickly engage in fierce combat against the Guelphs with whom they had previously allied. Because in the fray, and also when everything starts getting disordered, and you see from the other side your own same relatives that are recognizing and supporting you, you can't do this. This tells you also how confused and critical and chaotic the clash really was. And so there is this iconic moment in which, exactly during this moment in which all the darkest forces awaken, like which you are to beat, right, like your own fears and be a man and transfigure into holy war, the hand of the Florentine cavalry's standard bearer, who was valiantly holding his banner. I made a video about the Roman signiferi, and we explained like the traditional meaning of standard bearers. These people, like some are told that, that they died with their banner in their hand, like remaining on horseback, dead, but with the hand still holding the banner, and others like having their limbs cut, their arms cut, but still holding the banner with their teeth, right? And this guy gets his arm severed and with a sword cut, and the standard falls, which is of course the worst thing that can ever happen in the critical moment of the battle. And the loss of this important symbol instilled dismay and confusion among the Guelph ranks. The guy who cut the standard bearer arm was Bocca degli Abbati, that was a Ghibelline Florentine that was, at least in this mess, accused of having in fact betrayed Florence, and that Dante places in hell, right? The standard bearer was Jacopo de' Pazzi. So these are some of the most importantly aristocratic families in Florence, and they again all share this highly knightly culture that, in spite of the obvious political logic behind this action, still cared about the loyalty, the honor, and this action was very important for, of course, pivotal for the Sienese victory. But it's also recriminated against by the same Dante, that was reflecting on the Florentine bloodshed at Montaperti and saying, okay, you betrayed your fatherland, essentially. In that moment, the Ghibelline division, which had been concealed behind the Guelphs, they had managed to approach the battlefield undetected, initiates this decisive assault, attacking the Guelphs from the flank and successfully routing them, right? And this is really interesting. It seems that this was a clash taking place between cavalry mostly, that was decisive and in the fore. We know of the Florentine infantry that was, we can't say it was necessarily tougher than others. To say that the infantry was subordinated to cavalry, but these guys have the guts to resist. Also because they know that if they break, they will be cut down like grass by enemy cavalry. But in fact, they can resist only so long. Cavalry is decisive. You have the Sienese and German knights. And what follows is literally the largest bloodbath in 13th century Italy. There are incredibly vicious battles, massive slaughters. We will talk perhaps about Benevento next. But the Florentine bloodshed at Montaperti is really epic. So much so that Dante says that the waters of the Arbia river by the battlefield turned red because of how much blood had been spilled on that soil. And in fact, it's really this an ensuing pursuit that was that relentless as brutal. As we've seen, the Florentines were and their allies were many. There were 33,000, mostly infantry. And so imagine just chasing down these forces, initially all en masse, trying to escape here and there, throwing themselves in the river, finding, hospice in the neighboring castles that, yes, had been garrisoned by some trustee, but now, while essentially the Welf army melted away, would be retaken, the same peasants that hated the invaders would start chasing them down. And so, of course, this is one of the single most radically violent episodes in the entire medieval warfare. You have a literal bath of blood. Like the fact that the river would turn red is, it's just more like it's not much a large river, but in this sense it's possible that literally would have looked red in the concentration of all the people who tried to escape, that were massacred by their banks. This is really rough. It's really shocking. There is a final desperate attempt at resistance by the Guelphs who were fleeing toward Arezzo, occurring near the castle of Montaperti. That's the actual moment that we're talking about before, and it's from this incident actually that the battle takes its name, because otherwise it's not quite located at Montaperti. It's just like, the Battle of Tagliacozzo. It's not really, it was not really fought in Tagliacozzo, but nearby. So the Ghibelline suffered losses of around 1,000 fighters, while the Welf fatalities were considerably greater, estimated to be between 6,000 and 10,000. If you look at losses from the Ghibelline side, you realize how brutal this fight really had been, because this had been taken during the actual combat. It's one person out of 8, right? So, as you know, a unit that loses 1/8 of its force is heavily shattered to some degree. Here it's broader casualties, so yes, as a whole it's not the end of the world, but the type of warfare here with cavalry charges, infantry support, a shower of quarrels. We know too few again how things unfolded, but we have here already that normal infantry armament with pikes, pavises, crossbows to a degree that really pose significant challenges. Also to the same cavalry that, as superior as it was, would be tempested by all these blows. We made a video about pole arms, the Italians developed over time, the most advanced multifunctional form of bill, with a puncturing, fracturing, cutting, and slashing, ripping, let's say, better function. You can only imagine how traumatic this whole thing really was, but mostly it's the pursuit. It's the moment in which all those aforementioned rivalries, envies, hatred, sense of greatness would vent themselves through merciless slaughter, right? Like lambs. And this is the moment in which probably panic spreads among the formation. Everybody breaks, everybody flees, oblivious, right, of shame, of being lost, entering this darkness, while the victorious rulers charge ahead, right, blessed by God in heavenly riding. Divine punishment, divine judgment, this is how they would see it. And as we've seen, the Florentines have been that bold to presume to be able to tame Siena. But you gotta admire them. Even just the fact of having almost succeeded, as you see, the the Ghibellines were about to lose. Florence would have not conquered Siena, but they would have managed to impose a Welf regime that at this point would have changed a lot in Tuscan, Italian, and sort of international history. But again, from 6 to 10,000 dead from the Welf side, these numbers are substantial by the standards of the era, to say the least. It's a massacre, capital M. So most importantly, this represented a humiliating defeat for the proud city of Florence, a memory that continued to haunt Dante Alighieri, who reflected on it with horror, as we were pointing out in his Divine Comedy, with this multiple characters. We'll see now how Farinata fared later, because that's the moment of greater, also Florentine honor that was partly, ransomed after this. Thanks to him, we've seen Bocca degli Abbati. There are different references to this massive defeat that the Florentines felt within themselves, as a shame that they had to redeem from. The outcome of this clash, by the way, it was interestingly predicted, just to say what people sort of believed in at the time, by the astronomer from Forlì in Romagna, Guido Bonatti. By that time, he was likely already serving Frederick II of Swabia, and had been alerted to an assassination plot orchestrated by Pope Innocent IV. And this plot, which was aimed to wipe out the entire imperial family, was allegedly devised in the Salento castle of Capaccio in 1246. And so the astronomers were very important at the time, because it was believed that astrology and astronomy at the same time are the same thing, essentially, because they reflect, say, the influence of the celestial bodies, not simply determining passively like what the person will be, but simply reflecting what the person will be. There was an enormous symbology behind this that we have lost, in fact, in the most sort of sensualistic, sort of weird idea of astrology that we have today. Bonatti was well known for his prophetic abilities, because, of course, much of this order was seen as predictable through the stars. And in 1260, as he witnessed a potential agreement between Florence and Siena, he forecasted the triumph of the Ghibelline faction, in fact, just months before the Battle of Montaperti. Naturally, if there are two contendants, like one has to win, another has to lose, right? And here, however, he was doing so even before the campaign was even decided. Actually, when the negotiations seemed like possible agreement between the two rivals could occur. But anyway, after the Battle of Montaperti, there was a major upheaval in Florence. In fact, this opens until 1266, the Ghibelline phase in Florentine history, because, of course, the defeat at Montaperti had annihilated the Welf party, and the Ghibelline family could seize power in the city. And so, actually, this was a major change in the international scenario, because Tuscany now was virtually, not entirely Ghibelline, but its interland was now so, and this secured the Francigena road for the same ambitions of Manfred towards northern Italy and beyond. It was all an hegemonic project. I made a video about this by Manfred that was also Mediterranean in scale, really. Manfred is probably one of the single most unjustifiably underestimated or overlooked figures in medieval Europe. Man of enormous power, and much of this also passed through the Ghibelline exploit at Montaperti, as we've seen. Manfred's Germans had also consistently contributed to. So the exiled Florentine Ghibellines returned to their city as victors. Now, driven by a thirst for revenge, by the way, I mean, matters had been settled in Siena, now things had to be settled more directly in Florence. This was the normal as brutal political practice. The Ghibellines swiftly demolished the towers and homes of the leading wealth figures, all of whom had been forced into exile at this point, and confiscated their properties. Florence was on the brink of total destruction now, however, because there were so many enemies that she had collected throughout this period that now, while losing basically her entire army, and having against her like such a powerful ruler like King Manfred, that literally set such conditions for the destruction of Florence in a royal deliberation, things were getting pretty dark. And that's where the figure of Farinata degli Uberti stands out, because he was a great man, a great warrior. He had risked his life at Montaperti, and he was, however, even if Ghibelline, a Florentine. And this episode is, of course, remembered by Dante, that considered him as an enemy. But as you know, in hell, in the Inferno, Dante visits like the sepulchres of the Epicureans, and Farinata stands out like this statue almost, because he was so truly stoic and harsh, and this hard man that everybody liked, in that sort of truly actually traditional sense of hardness and unchangeability, of perennialism, right? Except, of course, in Dante's view, politically, he had chosen the wrong side for doing so, and this rigidity also corresponded to the fact that he would never, of course, he could never. Farinata was really an heroic figure, from the Ghibelline side, but also from the Florentine side. He could not change his actions, his intentions, right? He knew perfectly what he had to do. And there is this episode that is remembered, that during the Diet of Empoli, which is a town in Tuscany, that had been, say, a diet that had been convened to make a decision on the matter of the destruction of Florence. Say, let's get it over with it. This is like a tumor that is rising cancerously to infest us, and we want like a more sort of hegemonizable Tuscany from at least a Ghibelline edges, and some sort of greater, whichever order would have risen from that, nobody knows, because it fortunately didn't happen. But just think of how history could change at that point. In this council, imagine all hardcore Ghibellines and so many enemies of Florence. There is the steadfast opposition of Farinata degli Uberti, who vowed to defend his beloved city with arms, and played thus a pivotal role in preventing the destruction of Florence. This earns, at least in Dante's comedy, the perennial honor to Farinata, whose remains, after he had died and the Guelphs would actually come back to power because of the Angevin victory in southern Italy, were properly thrown out of his tomb, were dispersed in the street. Like, it was a terrifying thing. And again, because he was seen as an enemy of the church, accused of heresy. These were standard accusations. Like, the Ghibellines had the same identical proceedings, except like here it's like the dignity of this great man that was desecrated to a degree that fortunately Dante cancelled from memory. He wouldn't rejoice of that, and so the actions of those men were in a sense cancelled by the greatness of the voice of medieval civilization that Dante was. Pope Alexander IV decided, of course, at this point to excommunicate all the Tuscan Ghibellines. He had already his qualms with Manfred, to say the least. However, this move had an unintended consequence, further solidifying actually the bonds within the imperial faction. The only group that suffered significantly from the papal decree was the Sienese bankers, as the Welf debtors refused to repay their loans, citing the bankers' excommunicated status as a justification for the refusal. Plus, there was, of course, like a ban on trade and commerce, but that's, say, at this point, like the least of these politics concerns. So as you understand, like behind a battle, like this is what I wanted to transmit with this video of this caliber, or at least, Montaperti is fairly well known as a 13th century European battle. Like normally in disclosure books, it's always named. It's pretty international, etc. But of course, like pop culture has not really ingrained this particularly, at least as far as the context, because that's always the point, right? I make always, at least often, this point in my videos, that it seems to me, oddly enough, that here there is not even, you see, I was searching on YouTube, there are lots of videos about the Battle of Montaperti, but none of the bigger channels, this is exactly what I was saying, actually made a video on it. I'm glad that I will be the first one, because of the, you see, why? This is a major battle. It's literally cited in lots of works like Heats. It's, again, in every of the sort of, at least basic disclosure type of, regardless of how well it's reconstructed, or what kind of, criterion there is to list, for example, every single damn British battle, of even hundreds of men, but say not talking about like in the Cambridge, not in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare of even at the Battle of Monte Cassino, it was by far the largest, possibly, even in medieval Europe, and surely like in of the era, because people do not seem to care like how important medieval Italy really was. This is something that I honestly grew to understand by making videos on medieval warfare on YouTube, that people, for some incomprehensible reason, because I can't really, yes, there may be some reasons that are actually, say, incredibly negative and sort of strange, that are not even so obvious actually to reconstruct at all, but do not consider even these episodes as sort of particularly relevant. Again, why hasn't like all those major channels that cover even the last strange exotic battles for whatever reason talk about the Battle of Montaperti? It's one of the largest of the era. It's one of the bloodiest, one of the most politically eventful. Nobody knows. It's sort of weird and sad. And so this already, as you understand, I was checking right now, because I'm always curious to an extent. I hardly ever check this, whether somebody made a video on this, but say on my videos. But the sense, of course, being that, you see, even without knowing I was right? There is not been a mind behind all the hundreds or thousands of videos on with all hypergraphics, all the possible type of kind of content that will make a video about this beautiful battle. A shame. I can't. I think it's. You see, I could make an entire video describing this, right? And I think that this could easily bring us to some interesting place. But remember that history is not what you think it is. History is what it actually was, right? And until you understand that what you think does not matter compared to what it is, your life cannot self-actualize. Right? You will die away without any actual accomplishment. And this is the real problem that we're facing with people nowadays, that they think that their subjective feeling about whatever anything is, how they wish it was, is not met with it's met actually with cognitive dissonance. You see here, for example, I say, nobody talks about that. At least I make a video on it, and at least somebody will learn about this battle. People instead sort of go by the sense of strangeness of, say, okay, nobody cares. It's just history. But history intended as entertainment rather than history, right? And this is the thing that strikes me the most. That once you make a video every day, of course, you stop perceiving the sense of wonder from the other side, like about the actual historical topic. It's more like what Schwerpunkt uploads as opposed to what it actually talks about. And that's extremely disappointing sometimes. But I understand that there are people who appreciate, and to all those, of course, I always recommend to share this content as much as possible. I say it extra today because I never really do, except in the video, in the channel update episodes. This content, like if you really want to make a service to yourself, this is not much to me. Share them. See what they mean. See why we're supposed to learn about these stories. Right? Very well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.